The cold click of steel handcuffs cut through the quiet, candlelit dining room of one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. Officer Blaine Kessler wore a satisfied smirk, convinced he had just removed another dangerous man from a room full of wealthy patrons. He did not care about the man's perfectly tailored suit, the expensive watch on his wrist, or the unsettling calm in his eyes. What Kessler did not understand was that the man he had just humiliated was no criminal. His name was Desmond Whitaker, and he was one of the highest-ranking leaders in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Before the night was over, the officer who thought he controlled the room would discover what real authority looked like. The Wellington Steakhouse in downtown Boston was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made far in advance. The brass-trimmed revolving doors opened into a world of polished mahogany, low candlelight, expensive wine, and quiet old money. The staff seemed to know exactly who every guest was before a coat had even been checked. Desmond sat in a secluded corner booth, slowly turning a glass of aged Cabernet between his fingers. He was in his early 50s, tall, broad-shouldered, and composed in a way that made people notice him without knowing why. He did not need to raise his voice to command a room. Years of dangerous investigations, federal briefings, and difficult decisions had taught him how to remain still when everyone around him was losing control. For this dinner, he had left his usual professional armor behind. He wore a custom charcoal Zegna suit with an open collar. No tie, no federal insignia, nothing that announced who he was. Across from him sat his wife, Celeste. She wore a deep sapphire dress and carried the quiet elegance of a woman who had spent many years beside a man whose work often followed him home in the form of late calls, cancelled plans, and serious conversations that could not be repeated outside secure rooms. They were celebrating their anniversary, along with Desmond's recent confirmation as Executive Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's National Security Branch. The new position placed him among the most senior federal law enforcement officials in the country. Desmond regularly briefed national leaders. He had access to information that could never appear in a newspaper and authority that reached far beyond the walls of any city precinct. But none of that mattered to him at this table. Tonight, he was simply a husband trying to spend a quiet evening with the woman who had stood beside him through dangerous assignments, career changes, and years of uncertainty. "To us," Desmond said. His deep voice softened as he touched his glass to Celeste's. "And to fewer late calls from Washington." Celeste smiled. "I won't count on that," she said, "but I'll take tonight, just us." At another table, the mood was very different. Preston Vale, a wealthy local real estate developer with a reputation for anger and entitlement, was loudly complaining to the floor manager. Vale had arrived late and discovered that his favorite corner booth had already been given to another party. That booth was now occupied by Desmond and Celeste. To most people, the situation was simple. A guest had missed the time attached to his reservation, and the restaurant had seated someone else. To Preston Vale, it felt like an insult. And had spent years measuring respect by how quickly people moved when he demanded something. He treated service workers as if their only purpose was to anticipate his preferences and absorb his temper. Then he looked across the room and saw Desmond. What bothered Vale was not simply that another guest had his preferred table. It was that the guest was a black man. Vale did not see a senior federal executive. He did not see a husband enjoying dinner with his wife. He saw someone he believed did not belong in the room, sitting in a place he believed should have been reserved for men like him. Rather than accept another table, Vale stormed outside toward the valet area. Near the curb, Officer Blaine Kessler leaned against a patrol car with a cup of lukewarm coffee. Kessler was a veteran officer assigned to the 9th Precinct. His career had never advanced the way he believed it should have. Years of complaints, aggressive behavior, and disciplinary trouble had kept him at street level. He had spent much of his career watching younger officers move into better assignments while he remained exactly where he was, and the resentment had hardened into something ugly. People in the neighborhood knew his reputation. He was heavy-handed, casually cruel, and openly suspicious of people he considered beneath him. Prejudice was never far below the surface. Complaints followed him from one assignment to another, yet he had learned how to survive disciplinary reviews, lean on union protection, and describe nearly every confrontation as necessary officer safety. He also had a profitable relationship with wealthy men in the district. When certain businessmen wanted someone frightened, removed, or pressured, Kessler was often nearby. He called it helping important people maintain order. Others might have called it using a public badge as private muscle. Vale spotted him immediately. "Blaine," he called, marching toward the cruiser. "There's a problem inside." Kessler straightened. "What kind of problem, Mr. Vale?" "Some guy is sitting in my booth and refusing to move. He's causing a disturbance. Management won't do anything." Kessler looked interested. "A disturbance?" Vale leaned closer. "And doesn't belong in a place like this." He looked ready to get aggressive when I passed him. "Someone needs to teach him where he belongs." Kessler adjusted his duty belt. He did not ask the manager what had happened. He did not ask whether anyone had called the police. He did not ask whether a crime had occurred. He smiled. "I'll handle it." Kessler walked through the ornate entrance of the Wellington, his heavy boots striking the imported marble floor. Several diners looked up as the sound cut through the restaurant's soft music and quiet conversation. I ignored the hostess stand. Vale pointed from behind him. Kessler followed that gesture straight toward the corner booth. Desmond saw him synced for the officer reached the table. Years of field work had taught him to read posture before words. Kessler's rigid shoulders, narrowed eyes, and aggressive stride told Desmond almost everything he needed to know. Desmond did not move. "Can I help you, officer?" His voice was polite and steady. Kessler stopped at the table and folded his arms. He looked Desmond up and down, pausing on the tailored suit and expensive watch as though those things offended him. "I'm getting reports of a disturbance at this table," Kessler said loudly. "Management says you're causing trouble and you need to leave." Celeste put down her fork. "There must be some mistake, officer. We've been sitting here quietly. We're just finishing our anniversary dinner." Kessler barely looked at her. "I wasn't talking to you, lady." His eyes stayed on Desmond. "Stand up. We're taking a walk outside." Desmond remained seated. "Officer, we haven't caused any disturbance. We're paying customers with a valid reservation. If you speak to the manager, that can be confirmed immediately." "Don't tell me how to do my job, boy." The word landed heavily. Conversation at nearby tables faded. Celeste's expression changed, and her hand moved across the table toward her husband. Desmond's eyes hardened. For an instant, the relaxed diner disappeared and the federal executive took his place. But he did not react emotionally. Desmond had spent years investigating exactly this kind of conduct. He knew that an officer who wanted a confrontation could use anger as an excuse for escalation. I would not give Kessler that excuse. "Identification," Kessler demanded. His right hand settled near his sidearm. The gesture was obvious. "Now, before I pull you out of that booth myself," Celeste spoke quietly. Desmond. She knew he could end the uncertainty with a federal credential. She also knew the look on his face. "It's all right, Celeste," he said. Then he looked at Kessler. "My wallet is in my breast pocket. I'm going to reach for it slowly." Desmond removed a slim leather wallet and placed his Massachusetts driver's license on the table. He did not show his Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials. That was deliberate. I wanted to know how far Kessler would go while believing Desmond was an ordinary citizen. If an officer behaved this way toward a black man in a custom suit inside an elite restaurant, Desmond could only imagine how that same officer treated people with less money, less visibility, and fewer witnesses. Kessler picked up the license. "Desmond Whitaker." He looked at the name, then at Desmond. "How does a guy like you afford a place like this? Running numbers, credit card scams?" "I work for the federal government," Desmond said. "Officer, I strongly advise you to step back, contact your watch commander, and reconsider what you're doing." Kessler laughed. "Federal government? What, you deliver the mail?" He leaned closer. "Listen carefully. You're going to stand up, put your hands behind your back, and walk outside with me. If you don't, this is going to become very unpleasant." Desmond slowly placed his napkin on the table and rose. At full height, he stood several inches taller than Kessler. The difference seemed to irritate the officer. "I'm standing," Desmond said, "but I will not put my hands behind my back voluntarily. I have committed no crime." "Resisting arrest," Kessler shouted. Without warning, he grabbed Desmond by the shoulder and spun him. The movement was sudden and violent. Kessler drove Desmond against the edge of the heavy oak table. Fine china rattled, crystal glasses shook, a few diners gasped. The maitre d' froze. Celeste stood. "Officer, you need to stop this right now. You have no idea what you're doing." "Shut up, lady, or I'll arrest you for interfering." Kessler pulled Desmond's arms behind his back. Desmond did not fight. He offered no physical resistance. The handcuffs closed around his wrists with a series of cold metallic clicks. Desmond listened to every one of them and felt the pressure of the steel. He heard the movement of frightened diners, saw the expressions on Celeste's face, and he memorized everything. "You're making a catastrophic mistake, Officer Kessler," Desmond said quietly, reading the name on the officer's chest. "A career-ending mistake. Save it for the judge." Kessler shoved him forward. "Walk." He marched Desmond through the center of the restaurant as though displaying a trophy. Desmond's shoulders remained straight. The humiliation was real, but he refused to let Kessler decide what dignity looked like. Outside, the cool Boston air hit his face. Kessler pushed him into the rear seat of the patrol car. Desmond's knees struck the hard plastic partition. He said nothing. The door slammed. Inside the cramped vehicle, Desmond closed his eyes for a moment and took one slow breath. Kessler climbed into the driver's seat, sounding almost cheerful. She activated the radio. "Dispatch, this is 9th Adam 4. I'm transporting one prisoner for disorderly conduct, trespassing, and resisting arrest. Suspect is secured." The cruiser pulled away from the restaurant. Kessler adjusted the mirror so he could see Desmond. "You see, this is what happens when people like you forget their place," he said. "You put on a fancy suit, buy a nice watch, and start acting like you own the city." He smiled at his own reflection. "But you don't. This is my city. I know a fraud when I see one." Desmond sat still, hands secured behind his back. "You have not articulated lawful grounds for this arrest, Officer Kessler. You never established reasonable suspicion for an investigative stop, much less probable cause for taking me into custody. You are engaging in an unlawful detention and a deprivation of civil rights under color of law." Kessler laughed and slapped the steering wheel. "Listen to that. We have ourselves a legal scholar." He glanced at the mirror. "What did you do? Watch a crime show before dinner. Keep quiet before I pull over and teach you some manners." Desmond did not answer, and he had said enough. Now he was thinking about the 9th Precinct. The precinct had already been on the Federal Bureau of Investigation's radar. Investigators had heard repeated allegations of extortion, evidence tampering, discriminatory policing, and systemic civil rights abuses. The difficulty had always been proof. Witnesses were frightened. Some people who complained later refused to testify. Others worried about retaliation against relatives, businesses, or neighborhoods that still depended on the same officers for emergency help. Local procedures moved slowly, and each delay gave the precinct more time to close ranks. Police union attorneys challenged nearly every outside inquiry. Subpoenas were fought. Witnesses were questioned aggressively. Records had a way of becoming difficult to obtain. Desmond had spent months trying to find a lawful path into the precinct's internal structure. He knew suspicion was not enough. Federal investigators needed evidence that could survive a defense challenge. Evidence that showed not simply what's judgment by one officer, but a broader pattern of corruption protected by people with authority. Blaine Kessler had just created one. The officer believed he was driving an ordinary prisoner toward a local booking desk. Desmond understood that Kessler was unknowingly carrying a federal civil rights case directly into the building investigators had struggled to penetrate. The patrol car eventually entered the secured rear garage of the 9th Precinct. The building was old, dark brick with the familiar smell of bleach, stale sweat, and overworked ventilation. Kessler opened the rear door and hauled Desmond out by the handcuff chain. Then he pushed him up the concrete steps and through the metal entrance into booking. The room was noisy. Officers filled out paperwork. People waited in holding cells. Phones rang. Behind the elevated front desk sat Sergeant Everett Harlan, an older, heavy-set officer with tired eyes and the expression of a man who had seen too many bad shifts. "What do we have, Blaine?" "Got a live one, Sarge," Kessler said. He shoved Desmond against the metal booking counter, caused a scene at the Wellington, refused to leave, got aggressive, kept talking about working for the federal government, probably some kind of fraud operation. Harlan sighed and pulled an empty property bin closer. "All right. Empty your pockets. Wallet, keys, phone, watch, everything goes in the bin." "His hands are cuffed," Kessler said with a laugh. "I'll do it." Kessler searched Desmond roughly. He pulled out the slim leather wallet and tossed it into the plastic bin. Then he removed Desmond's expensive watch. For a moment, Kessler stared at it with obvious interest before dropping it beside the wallet. "Take the cuffs off, Blaine," Harlan said. "He's not going anywhere." Kessler reluctantly unlocked them. Desmond brought his hands forward and rubbed his wrists. He looked directly at Sergeant Harlan. "I'm formally requesting access to my phone so I can contact legal counsel," Desmond said. "And I strongly suggest you look inside that wallet before processing anything further." Kessler rolled his eyes. "Don't listen to him, Sarge. He's been talking nonsense since the restaurant." Harlan looked tired more than curious. He picked up the wallet because he needed identification for the booking paperwork. Then he opened it. His face changed. Inside was a heavy gold federal shield. Beside it was a Department of Justice identification card. Harlan stared. He'd read the name. Then the title. Desmond Whitaker, Executive Assistant Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation, National Security Branch. For a second, the noise of the booking room seemed to disappear around him. Harlan looked up at Desmond, then back at the credential. His hands began to tremble. "Blaine," he said quietly. Kessler was looking at his phone. "What?" "Blaine." Harlan's voice cracked. "What did you do?" Kessler finally looked up. "What are you talking about? He's a fake, probably bought the badge online." Harlan swallowed. "This is real." He turned the credential slightly beneath the fluorescent light. Department of Justice security features shimmered across the card. Harlan looked at Desmond again. "Sir, Director Whitaker, there has been a serious misunderstanding." Desmond did not blink. He reached into the property bin and picked up his phone. "My call, Sergeant." It was no longer phrased as a request. Harlan did not try to stop him. Kessler stepped forward. "Put the phone down. Stand down, Kessler." Harlan shouted so sharply that several officers in the room turned. "Do not touch him. Back away." Desmond dialed a secure number. A woman's voice answered. "Desmond." It was Deputy Director Maren Caldwell. She knew he had been at dinner with Celeste. A call from him under these circumstances meant something was wrong. "Are you safe?" "I'm standing in the booking room of the 9th Precinct," Desmond said. "I've been unlawfully detained, assaulted and arrested under false pretenses by Officer Blaine Kessler, badge number 74229. Silence followed. Then Maren's voice became cold and professional. "Understood, Director. What are your instructions?" Desmond looked at Kessler. For the first time, the officer's arrogance had begun to weaken. "Authorize Operation House Cleaning," Desmond said. "Assemble the hostage rescue team and the anti-corruption task force. Secure the precinct. Nobody enters or leaves without federal authorization." "Understood," Desmond continued. "Coordinate with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Preserve every digital system before local access can be changed." "We'll move immediately." Desmond ended the call. He placed the phone back into the bin. Then he looked at Harlan and Kessler. "Gentlemen, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is taking control of this precinct. I suggest you contact your captain." The booking room fell quiet. Sergeant Harlan secured the front entrance and began making calls. Kessler stood near the holding cells, his face pale. At one point, he moved towards a rear exit, saying something about contacting his union representative. Desmond stopped him with his voice. "Officer Kessler, leaving, after being informed that this facility is part of an active federal investigation, would create another problem for you. I suggest you remain where you are." Kessler stopped. Desmond stayed on the civilian side of the booking counter. He retrieved his watch and returned it to his wrist. "I was no longer simply a man who had been wrongfully arrested. I was the senior federal official, now responsible for making sure the evidence survived." Captain Gideon Rourke arrived in a rush. Rourke was a heavy-set, red-faced commander who ran the 9th Precinct with the authority of someone who rarely expected to be questioned. He had clearly been called away from home without warning. "What is going on here, Harlan?" His voice filled the room. "Why is the front door secured? And who is this man?" He pointed at Desmond. Before Harlan could answer, a deep mechanical sound rolled through the windows. Federal vehicles were arriving outside. The precinct, radio channels, filled with instructions. Local officers were ordered to remain in place and keep their hands away from their weapons. Rourke moved toward the front windows. The street had been shut down. A line of dark federal vehicles blocked the intersection. Armored response vehicles secured the alleys. A Black Hawk helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight washing the building in bright white light. Members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's hostage rescue team moved into position around the precinct. They carried tactical equipment and established a hard perimeter with disciplined precision. Rourke stared through the glass. "What in God's name?" The front doors opened under federal authority. Agents entered in formation. Several local officers instinctively moved their hands toward their duty belts. A federal team leader raised his voice. "Hands away from your weapons. Do it now." The local officers froze. Then they complied. Through the tactical teams walked Deputy Director Maren Caldwell, Her steel-grey hair was neatly pulled back, and her expression was focused enough to silence anyone who thought this was a misunderstanding that could be talked away. She walked straight to Desmond. Director Whitaker. She handed him a secure tablet. The perimeter is secure. Federal warrants covering the precinct's records, electronic systems, evidence storage, and relevant personnel have been approved by a United States District Judge. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division is monitoring the operation. Thank you, Marin. Desmond took the tablet. Then he turned toward Captain Rourke. Captain Gideon Rourke, I'm Executive Assistant Director Desmond Whitaker of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Effective immediately, your precinct is under federal control for purposes of this investigation. You are relieved of command over any evidence, personnel, or systems covered by these warrants. Rourke's expression collapsed. Director, there has to be some mistake. Whatever Kessler did, that's on him. We can handle this internally, department to department. Desmond gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Internally, he looked around the room. Captain, this precinct has 27 unresolved complaints involving excessive force, racial profiling, and extortion. Outside inquiries have repeatedly been obstructed by union challenges, internal delays, and witnesses who were pressured into silence. When one of your officers unlawfully detains and assaults a federal official because of racial prejudice, the issue no longer belongs to your internal process. Those complaints did not suddenly become important because I walked through the door, Desmond continued. They were important when ordinary residents filed them. The difference now is that your officer created a documented federal incident in front of witnesses, then brought the victim directly into the precinct. Your department has spent so much effort protecting from scrutiny. He turned toward Kessler. Officer Kessler, step forward. Kessler did not move. Two members of the hostage rescue team approached and guided him into the center of the booking room. Kessler's voice shook. I didn't know who you were. I swear. Vale told me you were causing trouble. I thought you were a fraud. I was doing my job. Your job, Desmond said, is to uphold the Constitution. Your badge is not a private service that wealthy people can rent when they want someone intimidated. Desmond looked at Marin. Have the cyber division preserve the servers. I want emails, messages, body camera records, internal reports, and all relevant digital evidence from the period covered by the warrant. Secure the evidence room. Nobody removes or alters anything. Kessler's eyes widened. You can't take our servers. Desmond stepped closer. Yes, we can. Then his voice lowered. And I know what you were attempting before the team arrived. Kessler froze. You moved toward the information technology area after learning who I was. If the evidence shows you intended to erase or alter body camera footage, that becomes obstruction of justice. Kessler said nothing. Federal agents began dismantling the protective walls the precinct had built around itself. Hard drives were secured. Paper files were boxed. Digital access was frozen. Officers were separated for individual interviews. Everything that had once depended on local loyalty was now being handled under federal evidence procedures. Desmond moved into Captain Rourke's office. The room was larger than the rest of the precinct, with a heavy oak desk and framed commendations on the wall. Marin stood near the door. In the center of the room sat Blaine Kessler. His badge and gun had been removed and sealed in evidence packaging. Desmond sat behind the desk. Let's talk about Preston Vale. Kessler shook his head too quickly. I don't know anything. He's just a citizen who reported a disturbance. Don't insult my intelligence, Blaine. Desmond folded his hands. Federal investigators have access to your phone records and financial history. We know about the limited liability company registered under your wife's maiden name. We know about the $5,000 monthly payments connected to Vale Holdings. Kessler's face sagged. Desmond continued. You were acting as an illegal private enforcer while carrying public authority. That is not neighborhood security. It is a corruption scheme under color of law. Kessler slumped in the chair. If I cooperate, what kind of deal do I get? Desmond's expression remained flat. I don't negotiate criminal immunity from this desk. Cooperation can be reported to federal prosecutors and considered in the normal process. It does not erase what you did. Kessler lowered his head. Then Captain Rourke's private phone rang. The line bypassed the main precinct switchboard. Desmond looked at the caller identification. Preston Vale. A faint smile crossed his face. Marin, preserve and record the call according to the warrant. Recording is active. Desmond pressed the speaker button. Rourke's office. Where is Blaine? Vale's voice came through the speaker, loud and irritated. I told him to deal with that guy at the restaurant, and now he's not answering. Tell me he put that arrogant suit in a cell. Kessler closed his eyes. Desmond leaned toward the phone. Mr. Vale, this is Executive Assistant Director Desmond Whitaker of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A silence followed. I'm the man you just called? The arrogant suit. Vale's breathing changed. Who is this? Is this some kind of joke? No one here is laughing, Preston. Desmond's voice was calm. You are speaking on a recorded federal line. You have just described directing a sworn police officer to remove me from a restaurant. Federal investigators also have financial records showing payments between your business interests and Officer Kessler. Vale's voice rose. You can't do this. I know the mayor. I have lawyers. I'll have your badge for this. You can call anyone you want. Desmond said, but federal agents are already arriving at your residence with a signed warrant. I recommend that you put down anything in your hands and follow their instructions. You're bluffing. Look outside, Preston. For a moment, nothing came through the speaker. Then, the faint sound of heavy vehicles could be heard in the background. A voice outside Vale's home announced the presence of federal agents and a warrant. The line went dead. Desmond leaned back in the chair. Kessler was openly crying now. Understood that the wealthy man whose favor had seemed so valuable could no longer protect him. Desmond looked at him. Consequences are not mysterious, Officer Kessler. Sometimes they are simply the result of choices finally meeting evidence. He did not say it with satisfaction. For Desmond, there was nothing mystical about what was happening. Kessler had accepted money from a wealthy businessman. He had used public authority to satisfy that man's private prejudice. He had arrested someone without first establishing a crime. Then, once he realized the identity of the man he had arrested, he had tried to move toward the systems holding the evidence. Each choice had narrowed the road in front of him. Now, the consequences were arriving, one after another. Not because Desmond had wished them into existence, but because records, witnesses, money trails, and digital evidence were beginning to tell the same story. Across the city, Preston Vale's estate had gone from silent luxury to controlled chaos. His mansion sat behind tall iron gates and carefully landscaped grounds. Inside, his private study, surrounded by dark wood, expensive paintings, and polished furniture, Vale stared at the phone he had dropped. The command from outside was clear. Federal agents had a warrant. Vale moved toward a large window and pulled the curtain aside, just enough to see his circular driveway. Armored, federal vehicles had entered the property. Agents in tactical equipment established a perimeter. The confidence that had carried Vale through restaurants, city offices, and private deals began to disappear. This is insane, he muttered. I own half this city. He grabbed a desk phone and called his attorney. There was no immediate answer. Before Vale could decide what to do next, federal agents entered the residence under the authority of the warrant. Their voices echoed through the marble foyer. Federal Bureau of Investigation, show your hands. Vale stepped into the hallway. The silk jacket and expensive loafers that had once made him look untouchable now looked strangely fragile against the discipline of the federal team. Special Agent Grant Holloway, the tactical team leader, gave the order. Preston Vale, do not move. Get on your knees and place your hands where we can see them. Vale's voice cracked. You don't understand. I know the mayor. I'm a major donor. You have no right to be here. Holloway secured his arms and placed him in handcuffs. We have a federal warrant signed by a United States District Judge, Mr. Vale. You are under arrest for bribery of a public official, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and racketeering-related offenses. Vale looked around his home. Federal agents moved through the rooms, securing computers, financial records, electronic devices, and material identified by the warrant. The wealth he had used as protection could not stop a lawful search supported by federal evidence. Back at the 9th Precinct, Desmond turned his attention to Captain Gideon Rourke. Rourke sat across from his own desk, looking exhausted. Murren Caldwell remained in the room. Desmond slid a thick Department of Justice dossier across the desk. Let's stop pretending this begins and ends with Blaine Kessler. Rourke did not touch the file. Whatever Kessler did, he acted alone. He's a rogue officer. I can't control every patrolman. Desmond's expression did not change. A rogue officer, and leaned forward. This precinct has been under federal scrutiny for more than a year. Kessler is not the whole problem. He's one visible part of it. Rourke looked up. Desmond continued. Investigators have been examining Vale's relationship with this precinct for months. We knew Kessler spent time around the Wellington and provided unofficial favors to wealthy people in the district. What we needed was strong, admissible evidence capable of supporting the broader federal investigation. Rourke stared at him. You knew? I went to that restaurant to have dinner with my wife, Desmond said. I did not instruct your officer to approach me. I did not ask Preston Vale to make a complaint. I did not tell Kessler to use racial language, threaten me, arrest me without probable cause, or place me in handcuffs. His voice lowered. Every one of those choices belonged to him, and those choices were possible because of a culture in this precinct that allowed misconduct to survive without meaningful consequences. Desmond tapped the dossier. The cyber investigation did not begin tonight. Federal analysts have already been mapping financial relationships connected to this building. Rourke's breathing became shallow. We know about the police union slush fund. Rourke looked away. We know that the $5,000 Vale paid Kessler each month did not all stay with Kessler. Investigators have identified $2,000 transfers connected to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under your brother-in-law's name. Rourke's shoulders dropped. He covered his face with both hands. Murren spoke from the corner. That financial structure may support charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, along with extortion and conspiracy. Rourke looked up quickly. I can give you the mayor. Desperation replaced defiance. Mayor Harrison Clay knew about the fund. He used officers for unofficial security during his campaign. I have emails. If I cooperate, I can testify. Desmond looked toward Murren. She gave a small nod. The information mattered, but it did not erase the captain's own conduct. Rourke appeared to understand that. The loyalty he had demanded from everyone beneath him was disappearing the moment his own freedom became uncertain. Desmond turned back. No one in this room can promise you immunity. If your information is truthful and independently verified, prosecutors can consider your cooperation when making charging and sentencing recommendations. That may affect what happens to you, but cooperation is not the same as innocence. Murren added that federal prosecutors, not Desmond, would decide whether the evidence justified additional charges and whether Rourke's assistance had meaningful value. Rourke swallowed. Desmond stood and buttoned his jacket. Process the evidence according to the warrants, he told Murren. Prepare the transport arrangements for any defendants formally taken into federal custody. Outside, news of the federal action spread quickly. By morning, the street around the 9th Precinct was crowded with media vehicles and camera crews. Reporters from across New England gathered behind barricades. Rumors had circulated for hours, but few understood how wide the investigation had become. Then the precinct doors opened. Federal agents emerged first. Behind them came members of the command staff who had been arrested under federal warrants. Captain Gideon Rourke no longer wore the confident expression he had carried inside his precinct. Sergeant Everett Harlan looked pale and exhausted. Officer Blaine Kessler followed under federal escort. The swagger that had filled the Wellington was gone. Kessler's face was streaked with tears. Beyond the reporters stood local residents. Some had sons who had been detained by officers from the 9th. Some owned businesses and had complained of pressure. Others had filed civil rights complaints that had gone nowhere. No one needed to throw anything or shout. They simply watched. For many of them, the sight of federal agents carrying boxes of records out of the precinct said enough. Desmond did not join the public procession and had no interest in standing in front of cameras. From a quiet position above the street, he watched the transport vehicles leave. She understood that arrests were not justice by themselves. An arrest was only the beginning of a legal process. Real accountability required evidence, defense rights, prosecutors, judges, juries, and verdicts that could survive scrutiny. The spectacle outside might satisfy people for a moment. The courtroom would determine what truly lasted. The federal case eventually moved into the John Joseph Moakley United States Courthouse in downtown Boston. The courtroom was packed. The investigation had exposed a structure much larger than one officer and one wealthy businessman. Federal prosecutors presented records, messages, financial documents, witness testimony, digital evidence, and audio. Desmond's federal smartwatch had recorded clear audio from the restaurant and automatically backed the file up to a secure Department of Justice system when the device detected a sudden biometric change during the physical confrontation. Investigators also recovered evidence related to Kessler's attempt to access precinct systems after learning Desmond's identity. That evidence supported an obstruction charge. The financial records were even more damaging. Federal analysts traced money from Preston Vale's business empire into accounts connected with Kessler and Rourke. They documented shell companies, offshore accounts, private payments, and a network of favors that had turned public authority into a private business arrangement. The jury was shown the limited liability companies, the Cayman Islands accounts, and the direct movement of money from Vale's real estate interests into accounts connected to sworn officers and precinct leadership. The government argued that the corruption was not casual or occasional. It had structure. Money moved in predictable ways. Favors were expected in return. Officers who should have served the public were instead being used to protect private interests and pressure people Vale considered inconvenient. Judge Theodore Ashford presided over the case. He was known for taking public corruption seriously and for treating abuse of government authority as a direct attack on public trust. When sentencing arrived, the courtroom became silent. Judge Ashford looked toward the defendants. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law is a serious betrayal of public trust, he said. His voice carried through the courtroom. A badge and a firearm do not belong to the person who wears them. They are instruments of authority entrusted by the public. That authority exists to protect the community, not to intimidate people for personal prejudice, private profit, or political favor. He looked first toward Preston Vale. Vale seemed physically diminished. The expensive suits that once projected control now hung loosely on him. The stress of the case had stripped away much of the polished appearance that once seemed inseparable from his identity. His business assets had been frozen and later subjected to forfeiture proceedings connected to the racketeering case. Federal authorities had seized the Chestnut Hill mansion, imported vehicles, offshore accounts, and other property traced to the criminal enterprise. Vale's expensive private legal team disappeared after his assets were frozen, leaving him dependent on court-appointed counsel. The man who had once boasted that he owned half the city now sat beside a public defender with none of the confidence he had shown when demanding his preferred table at the Wellington. Judge Ashford continued. Preston Vale, you believed wealth could purchase public power. You financed a system in which sworn officers were used as private enforcers for bribery of a public official, racketeering, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. This court sentences you to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole under the terms imposed by this court. The judge also approved the permanent forfeiture of assets that had been lawfully connected to the criminal scheme. Vale made a broken sound and sank back into his chair, staring ahead as though he could no longer understand how the life he had built had disappeared so completely. Then Judge Ashford turned toward Blaine Kessler. Officer Kessler, you used your badge as a weapon of personal prejudice and private greed. You arrested a man without lawful cause, ignored the most basic obligations of your office, and then attempted to interfere with evidence once you understood the consequences. Kessler gripped the edge of the defense table. The judge's voice remained steady. You are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Your felony convictions arising from conduct committed while on duty also result in the complete loss of your police pension. Under the applicable rules, you will serve your sentence at Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury. Kessler closed his eyes. The finality of the sentence seemed to drain whatever strength remained in him. The pension he had assumed would support him after retirement was gone. The badge was gone. The career he had used as a source of pride and intimidation had become evidence in the case that sent him to federal prison. Federal marshals moved forward after the court completed its orders. Desmond stood in the back of the gallery. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked out. The work had been necessary, but there was nothing joyful about watching people destroy their own lives through prejudice, corruption, and greed. There was only the quiet relief of knowing the evidence had been heard. Later, Desmond returned home. Warm evening light filled the quiet suburban house. The smell of roasting garlic and rosemary drifted from the kitchen. After the cold fluorescent precinct, the armored vehicles, the interviews, the court filings, and the public attention, the familiar stillness of home felt almost unreal. Celeste stepped out of the kitchen, drying her hands on a linen apron. She smiled when she saw him. "I saw the news," she said softly. Desmond placed his keys into the ceramic bowl near the door. Then he released a long breath. He wrapped his arms around his wife and rested his chin gently against her hair. "It's finally over," he said. The hard edge of the federal executive disappeared. For a moment he was simply Desmond again. Rourke, Kessler, Vale, the cases are finished. The 9th Precinct is under permanent federal monitoring and reform. Celeste looked up at him. "You did something difficult," she said, "but you did something good. The city is safer because people finally had to answer for what they did." Desmond gave her a tired smile. "I did my job." Then his expression softened. "But I think we still have unfinished business." Celeste raised an eyebrow. "What kind of unfinished business, Director Whitaker?" Desmond reached into his jacket and pulled out a white envelope with gold lettering. "The Wellington's general manager contacted my office. The restaurant is under new ownership, and they wanted to apologize personally for what happened during our last visit." And handed her the envelope. "They offered us the private rooftop dining room, so we can finally finish the anniversary dinner in peace." Celeste laughed. The sound filled the hallway and seemed to chase away the last weight of the case. "I suppose I can tolerate you in that serious suit one more evening," she said, "as long as you promise the handcuffs stay locked in your office this time." "You have my word." Desmond took her hand. Outside their home, the legal system continued moving. Investigations continued. Reforms continued. Federal monitors remained at the 9th Precinct. The work of rebuilding public trust would take far longer than one trial. Desmond knew that justice was rarely a single dramatic moment. It was a process. It was evidence being preserved when someone wanted it hidden. It was a frightened witness deciding to tell the truth. It was an officer choosing not to follow an unlawful command. It was a court refusing to treat wealth or status as protection from consequences. And sometimes it was a person who had every reason to respond with rage, choosing discipline instead. Desmond's calm had never meant weakness. At the restaurant, he could have displayed his badge immediately and ended the confrontation before it grew. Instead, he wanted to understand how Kessler behaved when he believed the man in front of him had no special power. That choice exposed something larger than one bad arrest. It revealed how prejudice can become dangerous when authority is combined with the belief that no one will ever question it. But the story also revealed something else. Real power does not have to humiliate. It does not need to shout. It does not need to make another person feel small. The strongest authority is often the kind that remains controlled because it understands the responsibility attached to every decision. Kessler had a badge, but he treated it like permission. Desmond had far greater authority, but he treated it like a burden. That difference shaped everything that followed. Preston Vale believed money could buy obedience. Captain Rourke believed loyalty inside the precinct could bury misconduct. Kessler believed a uniform made his judgment unquestionable. Each man confused access to power with freedom from consequence. They were wrong. Power without responsibility eventually becomes fragile. The more people depend on intimidation, secrecy, and fear to protect themselves, the more vulnerable they become when truth is finally documented. That is why accountability matters. It is not only punishment. At its best, accountability protects the next person. The federal monitoring of the precinct mattered because residents deserved officers who understood that public trust was not optional. The preservation of evidence mattered because people who had been ignored deserved records that could not simply disappear. The prosecution mattered because a badge should never become a shield for behavior that would be unacceptable from anyone else. And the outcome mattered because the law means very little if it only works for people who already have influence. Desmond understood that better than anyone. She had the title, the resources, and the connections to force immediate attention. Most people do not. That was the part of the evening at the Wellington he never forgot. If Kessler had known who Desmond was, he almost certainly would have behaved differently. But respect that appears only after a powerful title is revealed is not real respect. Dignity should not depend on a credential. A person should not need a federal badge, an expensive suit, a famous name, or influential friends to be treated fairly. That lesson reached far beyond policing. Every day, people make choices about how they treat those who seem unable to help them, reward them, or challenge them. Those moments reveal character. It is easy to be polite to someone powerful. It is harder and more meaningful to offer the same dignity to someone whose status you do not know. Celeste understood another side of the lesson. She had watched her husband remain calm while being insulted and handcuffed in front of a restaurant full of strangers. She had seen the danger in his eyes, not because he wanted revenge, but because he understood exactly how serious the officer's choices had become. Still, Desmond never lost control. He did not resist physically. He did not threaten Kessler with personal retaliation. He did not use his position to humiliate the officer in return. He allowed evidence, law, and procedure to do the work. That kind of restraint is not passive. It takes strength to remain clear-headed when someone is trying to provoke you. It takes confidence to know that dignity does not disappear simply because another person refuses to recognize it. And it takes character to pursue justice without letting anger turn into cruelty. The people who suffered under the 9th Precinct also mattered. Their experiences were not erased because Desmond's case became the one that finally broke the system open. If anything, those earlier complaints gave the federal investigation its deeper purpose. Desmond's arrest became powerful evidence because it connected with a pattern other people had already tried to describe. Their voices mattered before a federal executive was involved. The tragedy was that it took someone with Desmond's position to force the system to listen. The reforms that followed could not return lost time or erase fear. They could not undo humiliating stops, pressured businesses, or ignored complaints. But change still mattered. A better policy could prevent another abuse. A preserved recording could protect another innocent person. A supervisor, willing to challenge misconduct, could stop another bad decision from becoming a tragedy. A young officer watching the case might understand that loyalty to the law must come before loyalty to a colleague who violates it. Second chances do not always mean escaping consequences. Sometimes a second chance belongs to the institution. A damaged department can choose to rebuild trust. A community that has been ignored can finally be heard. An officer who once stayed silent can decide to speak the next time. A person who has been wronged can decide not to let that experience define every future relationship. Forgiveness, when it comes, does not require forgetting what happened. It does not mean pretending harm was harmless. It can exist beside accountability. It can mean refusing to carry another person's bitterness inside your own life forever. For Desmond, peace did not come from watching Kessler cry in court. It came from walking through his own front door and seeing Celeste. It came from knowing the case was finished, the evidence had survived, and the precinct would no longer operate exactly as it had before. It came from understanding that he had answered humiliation without surrendering his values. That may be the quietest lesson of all. We do not always control what others assume about us. We do not control every insult, every unfair judgment, or every abuse of authority we encounter, but we do control what we become in response. We can choose to become consumed by the same anger that harmed us, or we can choose clarity. We can choose responsibility. We can choose truth. We can choose to protect someone else from experiencing what we experienced. That does not make injustice acceptable. It makes our response meaningful. Desmond's story was never really about a powerful man revealing an even more powerful badge. It was about what happened before anyone knew the badge existed. A husband sat at dinner with his wife. A stranger decided he did not belong. A wealthy man used prejudice to turn inconvenience into accusation. An officer accepted the accusation because it matched what he already wanted to believe. And step by step, ordinary choices became serious consequences. That is how many failures begin. Not with one enormous decision, but with small moments when someone chooses arrogance over curiosity, assumption over evidence, loyalty over integrity, or cruelty over simple respect. The opposite is also true. Better outcomes begin with small choices. Ask before accusing. Listen before judging. Use authority carefully. Speak when silence would protect wrongdoing. Admit mistakes before they grow. Treat people with dignity even when no one important is watching. Those choices may never make headlines. They may never lead to a courtroom, but they shape families, workplaces, communities, and institutions every day. True strength is not measured by how much fear a person can create. It is measured by how responsibly they use whatever power they have. Honor is not proven by a badge, a title, a bank account, or a uniform. It is proven in the moments when abusing those advantages would be easy. Justice is not perfect, and it is rarely fast. But it becomes possible when people preserve facts, tell the truth, accept responsibility, and refuse to let intimidation become normal. And kindness is not weakness. Sometimes, kindness is simply the decision to treat another human being as fully human before you know who they are, what they own, or what they can do for you. Desmond Whitaker returned home with his career intact and his authority unchanged. But the part of the story that mattered most was not that he had been powerful all along. It was that he never needed to misuse that power to prove it. If this story stayed with you, remember that the most important test of character often comes when we believe we have the upper hand. That is when respect matters most. That is when restraint matters most. And that is when our choices reveal whether the power we hold is being used to serve others or simply to serve ourselves. Share this story with someone who believes courage can be quiet, justice can be patient, and real strength does not need to shout. If you value stories about dignity, accountability, second chances, and people who refuse to let unfairness define them, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, share what stayed with you most. Was it Desmond's calm in the restaurant, Celeste's loyalty beside him, the collapse of a corrupt system, or the simple reminder that every person deserves respect before anyone knows their title? Sometimes, the most lasting form of justice begins with one very ordinary decision. Choose to do the right thing, even when you believe no one powerful is watching.